Think about a man. Actually, scratch that. Think about a woman. You know what? Neither of those descriptions is accurate. Let's try a third option. Imagine a baby boy who was forced to grow up as a girl, who then had to fight his way back to becoming a man, right before the sheer weight of that trauma finally broke him. It sounds like a sick, twisted psychological thriller cooked up in a Hollywood writer's room, right? Except it isn't fiction. It actually happened. Every single agonizing detail of it is real. By the end of this video, you are going to question everything you think you know about identity, biology, and human nature. You're going to see how far a mad scientist will go when he treats a human soul like a laboratory rat. This is the tragic, forbidden reality of David Reimer. Now, before we pull back the curtain on this dark piece of history, a quick warning. Because of the heavy nature of this case, this video runs an incredibly high risk of being shadow banned or restricted by the algorithm. If you think these stories need to be told, please hit that like button and drop a comment down below. It takes less than 2 seconds, but it's the only way to help a solo creator survive the algorithm. Are you ready? Let's go back to where the nightmare began. Our story starts in Canada, 1965. A young couple, Janet and Ron Reimer, welcome identical twin boys into the world, Bruce and Brian. At first, the boys are a textbook definition of perfectly healthy, happy babies. But by the time they reach 8 months old, their parents notice something alarming. The boys are crying, screaming, and visibly struggling just to do something as simple as urinating. Terrified, Janet and Ron rush them to the hospital. The diagnosis? Phimosis. It's a common condition where the opening of the foreskin is too narrow, making it impossible to retract. Today, it's easily manageable, but back then, the doctor gave them a definitive, simple solution. Both boys needed to be circumcised. Janet hesitated. Something in her gut felt off. But they were young, they were scared, and they wanted their babies to stop hurting. So, they trusted the white coat. They signed the papers. It was decided that Bruce would go under the knife first. But instead of using a standard, sterile surgical scalpel, the doctor decided to try something else. He opted for an electrocautery tool, a device that uses intense, high-frequency electrical currents to heat up and slice through tissue. The benefit was supposed to be that the extreme heat instantly seals the flesh, preventing any bleeding. But on that operating table, the unthinkable happened. The equipment malfunctioned, or the doctor slipped. The records vary, but the result was catastrophic. A sudden surge of high heat completely burned off almost the entirety of baby Bruce's organ. It wasn't just damaged, it was incinerated. It was a completely irreversible, life-shattering mistake made in a matter of seconds. Can you even begin to understand the horror those parents felt when the doctor walked out of that room to deliver the news? Horrified and deeply traumatized by the failure, Janet and Ron immediately cancelled the surgery for the second twin, Brian. Ironically, Brian's phimosis actually healed completely on its own over time. But for Bruce, his anatomy was ruined, his future was blank, and his parents were left drowning in a sea of absolute helpless guilt. For months, Bruce's parents lived in a waking nightmare, desperately searching for a miracle. Then, one afternoon, Janet was watching television and saw a smooth-talking, highly charismatic psychologist named Dr. John Money. At that exact moment, Money was a rising academic superstar at the prestigious Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He was pushing a radical, groundbreaking theory that was taking the scientific world by storm. Gender identity is not biological. It is entirely a social construct. According to Money, human beings are born completely gender neutral. We are blank slates. He claimed that if you take any baby and aggressively raise them as a boy or a girl before the age of 2, they will completely accept that reality. He called this window of development the gender gate. But let's be honest here, it was just a theory. Money had absolutely zero empirical proof to back it up. He was a scientist desperately looking for a canvas to paint his masterpiece on. And then, Janet Reimer's desperate, heart-wrenching letter landed on his desk. When Dr. Money read about what happened to Bruce, he didn't see a tragedy. He saw a goldmine. He saw the ultimate once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to prove his theory to the entire global medical establishment. Think about it. He had identical twins. One was perfectly intact, and the other was anatomically altered. It was a flawless scientific control group. Money responded to the family almost immediately. Within weeks, the terrified Reimer family packed their bags. and traveled to Baltimore to see the genius doctor. When they arrived, Money looked them in the eye and offered a terrifyingly radical plan. He told them, castrate the boy completely, surgically fashion a prosthetic female organ using the remaining tissue, give him female hormones, change his name to a girl's name, and above all else, never, ever tell him he was born a male. It sounds like psychological torture, doesn't it? But to a pair of broken parents who thought their son's life was already over, Money looked like a savior. They trusted the expert. They signed their son's life away. At just 22 months old, Bruce was legally erased from existence, and Brenda Reimer was born. For the next decade, Dr. John Money used the Reimer family as his personal ticket to scientific immortality. He paraded his findings to the medical community, publishing papers and eventually a book in 1975 titled Sexual Signatures. In his writings, Money declared the John/Joan case, the codename he used for the twins, an absolute, unmitigated triumph. He proudly wrote that Brenda had completely adapted to being a girl. He claimed she despised pants and passionately preferred wearing frilly dresses, ribbons, and bracelets. He noted that she loved being daddy's little girl and showed zero signs of ever knowing she was born a boy. Money used this case to single-handedly reshape Western medicine's approach to gender identity. Because of David's forced transition, doctors around the world began performing similar reassignments on thousands of infants without a second thought. But what Money was publishing to the world was a disgusting, fabricated lie. Behind closed doors, far from the cameras, Brenda's life was an absolute living hell. Every single year, the twins were forced to travel back to Money's clinic in Baltimore for evaluations. And these evaluations were nothing short of abusive. To force Brenda to accept her female identity, Money would subject the young children to deeply inappropriate therapy. He forced them to look at explicit photos of naked adults. He pressured Brenda constantly, telling her she needed to submit to even more invasive surgeries to make her look like a real woman. And inside Brenda's mind, a war was raging. No matter how many dresses they forced her into, no matter how many dolls they handed her, Brenda felt an innate, unshakable wrongness deep inside her bones. She didn't feel like a girl. She didn't walk like a girl. She didn't talk like a girl, and her voice was naturally deep and heavy. When she went to school, she didn't fit in with the girls and she was rejected by the boys. The local kids smelled the vulnerability and turned her life into a war zone of brutal, relentless bullying. They called her a freak. They called her a monster. You cannot build a stable life on top of a radioactive lie. Eventually, the pressure cooker of the Reimer household completely imploded. The guilt of what they had allowed Dr. Money to do began eating the parents alive from the inside out. Ron, the father, spiraled into severe, unchecked alcoholism just to numb the pain. Janet, the mother, was consumed by such a dark depression that she eventually attempted suicide. And what about the other twin, Brian? Imagine growing up next to a sibling who is being mentally dismantled by a mad scientist, knowing you were just inches away from the same fate. Brian couldn't cope with the toxic reality of his household. He spiraled into heavy drug addiction and slipped into a life of petty crime. By 1980, Brenda was a teenager, and she was on the absolute brink of ending her own life. She flatly refused to ever step foot in Dr. Money's office again. Seeing that their child was going to die if this continued, local doctors stepped in and gave Janet and Ron a hard truth. The lie has to stop. You have to tell them. Imagine this scene. It's 1980. Ron Reimer takes his 2 teenage children to a local restaurant. He sits them down, his hands trembling. And right there, over a regular meal, he lays bare the entire horrific truth. He tells Brenda, "You aren't a girl. You were born a boy named Bruce. Your entire life has been an experiment." When Brenda heard those words, she didn't break down into tears. She didn't scream. Instead, a massive, overwhelming wave of peace washed over her. Years later, reflecting on that exact moment, David said, "Suddenly, I understood why I felt the way I did. I wasn't a freak. I wasn't crazy. I finally knew who I was." Janet, the mother, later recalled the profound guilt she felt, remembering how Brenda had violently torn off the very first dress they ever forced her to wear as a toddler. She admitted, "There were doubts all along, but I couldn't face them. Because if I faced them, it meant admitting I was wrong. And I couldn't afford to be wrong. The moment the truth was out, Brenda was gone. He immediately shed his clothes, cut his hair, and took the name David. He began a grueling, painful process to reclaim his stolen manhood. He underwent massive rounds of testosterone therapy and endured multiple agonizing reconstructive surgeries to try and rebuild the anatomy that had been stolen from him by a careless doctor and an arrogant psychologist. It was another physical and mental nightmare, but this time, it was his choice. David was finally acting on his own free will. Against all cosmic odds, David actually managed to build a beautiful life out of the ashes. He proved to be one of the most resilient human beings to ever walk the earth. In his 20s, he met a compassionate woman named Jane. They fell deeply in love, and they got married. Because of his medical past, David could never biologically have children of his own, so he dedicated his entire soul to being the ultimate stepfather to Jane's 3 kids. For 14 years, David lived a quiet, peaceful life. He went camping, he went fishing, and he collected old coins and antiques. He found a way to survive the unsurvivable. But David knew that his story couldn't just remain a secret. He knew that out there, right at that very moment, other innocent children were still being subjected to Dr. Money's radical, unproven theories. David teamed up with a brave sexologist named Milton Diamond. Diamond had been one of the few scientists who openly criticized John Money's lack of actual evidence. Together, David and Diamond went completely public. They published the real truth of the John/Joan case, blowing the whistle on the entire medical community. They exposed Dr. John Money as a fraud, an abuser, and a liar who had fabricated his data for fame. Their exposure caused a massive global scandal, forcing medical boards across the world to completely rewrite their ethics guidelines, saving countless infants from going through the same forced transition. David had won. He had rewritten history. But as the old saying goes, you can escape your past, but you can never truly outrun the ghosts in your mind. No matter how much public good David did, he could never completely shut out the dark, traumatic memories of that Baltimore clinic. And then, the universe dealt him a final fatal blow. In 2002, David's identical twin brother Brian, the only person alive who truly shared the weight of that family's curse, suffered a fatal antidepressant overdose. Brian was gone. David was hit with a paralyzing wave of survivor's guilt. The psychological armor he had spent decades building began to crack. And then, the dominoes fell rapidly. Because of his severe depression, David lost his job. He was completely broke, facing total financial ruin. And in the midst of that absolute darkness, his wife Jane, unable to handle the crushing weight of his collapsing mental state, told him she wanted a divorce. Even the strongest iron will snap if you put enough weight on it. On a cold day in May 2004, at just 38 years old, David Reimer drove to a parking lot, stepped out of his vehicle, and chose to end his own life. Think about the sheer, unmitigated cruelty of his existence. Bruce was born, Brenda was raised, David died. He was a man caught in a horrible trap between the biology he was born with and the identity that an arrogant scientist tried to beat into his brain. In the end, every single exit was closed off. Honestly, guys, my brain can barely process a tragedy this deep, so I am leaving the floor entirely to you. What do you think about the ethical boundaries of the medical establishment? How do we ensure something this horrible never happens again? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments down below. If this story impacted you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I produce, write, and edit all of these videos completely by myself, and your interaction is the only thing that keeps this channel alive against the algorithm. Take care of yourselves, look out for each other, and as always, I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe